The German Chemist's Tale from Chapter 62, being read by Hattie. Cyril Altamont is a long-legged man aged 55, dressed in good English suiting and florid linen, with thinnish canary yellow hair, blue eyes set close together, a close-clipped strawberry-colored mustache, and carefully manicured hands. In his own sphere, he passes for a very energetic, cautious, and coldly practical man of business. But that didn't prevent him from behaving, on one occasion at least, with a lack of foresight which subsequently turned out to be disastrous for his bank. In the early 1960s, Altamont received a visit from a man with thin hair and poor teeth, Wessel by name. Wessel was at that time professor of organic chemistry at Green River University, Ohio, but during the Second World War he had been director of the mineral chemistry laboratory at the Chemist Academy in Mannheim. In 1945, he was one of the men whom the Americans confronted with the following alternative. He could either agree to work for them, emigrate to the United States, and accept an interesting appointment, or be tried as an accessory to war crimes and be sentenced to many years in prison. This operation, known as Operation Paperclip, hardly left much choice to men like Wessel, and he was one of maybe 2,000 scientists, the best known of them, even now, being Werner von Braun, who set off en route to America together with several tons of scientific archives. Wessel was persuaded that, thanks to the war effort, German science and technology had made prodigious advances in many areas. Some techniques and methods had been made public since then. For instance, it was known that the fuel used to power V2s was potato alcohol. Similarly, details had been released on the use of copper and tin in judicious proportion, which had allowed the manufacture of field batteries found nearly 20 years later in perfect working order in the middle of the desert on tanks abandoned by Rommel. But most of these discoveries had been kept secret. Wessel hated the Americans, and he was sure that they were incapable of finding the answers for themselves, and that they would not know how to use them effectively even if they were told. Whilst waiting for a rebirth of the Third Reich to give him the opportunity to apply such front-end research, Wessel decided to rescue and preserve the scientific and technological heritage of Germany. Wessel's own specialism was in the field of carbon hydrogenation, that is to say, petroleum synthesis. The principle was straightforward. Theoretically, all that was needed was to combine a hydrogen ion and a molecule of carbon monoxide to produce petroleum molecules. The process could be performed using a carbon base, but it could be applied equally well to a lignite or peat base. And it was for that very reason that the German war industry had taken a formidable interest in the problem. Hitler's war machine effectively required supplies of petroleum which the country did not possess amongst its own subterranean resources, and it thus had to rely on synthetic fuels extracted from the huge deposits of lignite in Prussia and the no less colossal reserves of Polish peat. Wessel was perfectly familiar with the program of experiments concerning this metamorphosis, for it was he who had devised the process at the theoretical level, but he knew almost nothing about the technology of some of the crucial intermediate stages, in particular details of the quantities required and the duration of activity of the catalysts, the extraction of sulfuric deposits, and storage precautions. So Wessel set out to contact all his former colleagues, now dispersed all over North America. He steered clear of the sauerkraut clubs, the Sudetenland circles, and Sons of Aachen, and other setups fronting for organizations of old Nazis, which he knew were almost always infiltrated by informers, but by using periods of leave and corridor conversations at congresses and conferences, he managed to find 72 of them. Many didn't want anything to do with his project. Professor Thaddeus, the magnetic storm specialist, and Davidoff, the fragmentation specialist, would not say anything, and even less could be said by Dr. Colliker, the atomic scientist who had lost his arms and legs when his lab was bombed, but who was considered to have the subtlest brain of his age. Although he was, in addition, both deaf and dumb, permanently surrounded by 4 bodyguards and assisted by a specialist engineer who had been through intensive training for the sole purpose of lip-reading the invalid's equations, which he then wrote on a blackboard. Colliker had developed a prototype of the strategic ballistic missile, the forerunner of Berman's classical Atlas rocket. Many others, at the Americans' instigation, had switched disciplines entirely and had assimilated themselves to the American way of life, to such an extent that they didn't want to remember what they had done for the Vaterland, or refused to talk about it. Some went so far as to denounce Wessel to the FBI, which was quite pointless, as the FBI had not ever ceased for a second its surveillance of all these recent immigrants. And 2 of its agents tailed Wessel on each of his trips, wondering what he could be looking for. In the end, they summoned him for questioning, and when he confessed that he was trying to recover the secret of turning lignite into petrol, they released him, since they really could not see anything basically anti-American about such an enterprise. In time, Wessel nonetheless achieved his aim. In Washington, he laid his hands on a bundle of archives which the federal government had studied and had judged to be without interest. In it, he found the description of the containers used for the transportation and storage of synthetic petrol, and 3 of his 72 former compatriots agreed to provide him with the answers he was after. Wessel wanted to return to Europe. He contacted Bidrem, and in exchange for appointment to the post of engineering consultant, he offered to reveal to Cyril Altamont all the secrets relating to the hydrogenation of carbon and the industrial production of synthetic fuel. And, as an added bonus, he went on with a black-toothed grin, a method for making sugar from sawdust. By way of proof, he handed Altamont a few typescript sheets covered with formula and figures, the overall equations of the transformation, and the only secret to be truly disclosed, the names, specifications, required quantities, and duration of activity of the mineral oxides to be used as catalysts. The fantastic leap forward that the war was supposed to have fostered in science, and the secrets behind Germany's military superiority, did not interest Cyril Altamont overmuch. He put that sort of thing in the same basket as the stories in the popular press about hidden SS treasure and the Loch Ness Monster, but he was sufficiently conscientious at least to have a technical assessment made of the methods Wessel was proposing. Most of his scientific advisors mocked the obsolete, burdensome, and clumsy techniques. In effect, you could have run rockets on vodka, just as the French had run their motor cars in wartime on charcoal gas. Petrol could be made from lignite or from peat, and even from dead leaves, old rags, or potato peel. But it would be so expensive and would require such a monstrous plant that it was infinitely preferable to carry on using good old black gold from the ground. As for making sugar from sawdust, it was entirely devoid of interest, as the experts unanimously forecast that in the medium term, sawdust would be a far more precious commodity than sugar. Altamont filed Wessel's documents and dropped the whole matter, and for many years used the anecdote as a typical illustration of scientific stupidity. 2 years ago, toward the end of the first great oil crisis, Bidrem decided to sponsor research on synthetic fuels based on graphites, anthracites, coal, lignite, peat, bitumen, resins, and organic salts. It has invested in such research more than 100 times the amount Wessel would have cost had the bank employed him. Altamont tried several times to get in touch with the chemist again. In the end, he found out he had been arrested in November 1973, a few days after the OPEC meeting in Kuwait, at which the decision was made to reduce deliveries of crude to most consumer countries by at least a quarter. Charged with attempting to pass strategic secrets to a foreign power, specifically Rhodesia, Wessel had hanged himself in his cell.